Introduction to Eating Disorders. Well, a good place to start in sort of setting the stage for this course is to look at the actual clinically recognized, acknowledged categories of eating disorder in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. And currently those include anorexia or anorexia nervosa, bulimia or bulimia nervosa, and eating disorder not otherwise specified, or EDNOS. How many of you know one or more people who has experienced anorexia or bulimia or some other significant struggle with eating? Chances are good that you're likely to either know someone or know of someone who's experienced significant clinical challenges with their eating and with their weight. Fact is, about 10% of all Americans are thought to have an eating disorder, and 90 to 95% of these are women, although the prevalence rate of eating disorders among men is clearly picking up. Importantly, this overall prevalence rate, about 10% of Americans qualifying for diagnosis of one or more of the significant clinically recognized eating disorders, is probably a conservative estimate. It's a conservative estimate because, on the one hand, it's based on self-report, and of course many people are reluctant to reveal or disclose or report that they have an eating disorder. But secondly, it's based on self-report, and many disorders of eating, particularly anorectics, actually don't even recognize that they have an eating disorder, so they would be unlikely to report it. In fact, in anorexia, the denial of the problem is a key feature, and a key feature or factor that prevents the individuals from seeking treatment, because although they are engaged in self-starvation, they don't see themselves as imperiled, they don't see themselves as medically compromised, and they don't see themselves as actually having an eating disorder. And for that reason, they're just not likely to report that they do. So the 10% figure is probably a conservative figure. In addition to recognized clinical disorders, however, a huge percentage of our population actually struggles with issues of weight and body satisfaction. About 85% of American women, for example, report being dissatisfied with one or more aspects of their body, either their overall weight or a specific location, feeling as if their tummy is too fat, or their waist is too large, or their thighs are too thick, or their butt is too big. In other words, they have an identified image dissatisfaction with one or more body part. This difference between the non-clinical forms of eating disorder and body dissatisfaction and the clinical forms, anorexia, bulimia, and eating disorder not otherwise specified, is known as the eating disorder spectrum. And again, it can range from really seriously medically compromised, imperiled individuals like profound and chronic anorectics, all the way to people who are engaged in chronic dietary restraint, are continuously aware of sort of chronic dietary consciousness, or yo-yo dieting. And this represents the vast spectrum of eating disorders. Well, where do these notions come from, and how early do they start? Well, in a study by Juan and Brown in 1986, they found that in their study of elementary and middle school girls, that over 70% of the girls they studied had started dieting by the age of 10, which would be roughly third or fourth grade. Already they were making a connection between the way they looked and the way they felt, and the sense of self-esteem, confidence, capability, and worthiness was getting tied to the way they looked and the size of their bodies. This isn't surprising when you consider that Americans spend over $30 billion a year on weight loss products designed to make their bodies smaller so that they can feel better about themselves. And of course, this doesn't even begin to address the additional $30 to $50 billion that are spent broadly in the area of cosmetics, all of which are designed to alter, modify, enhance, change the person's looks, their appearances. And by virtue of that, all of these products are designed basically to underscore the link, the association between the way in which we look and the way in which we feel. there's a tendency to objectify individuals, and that their self-value then becomes tied to the size of the bodies and the way in which they look. Well, let's turn to take a closer look at the recognized eating disorders themselves, and we'll start with the first eating disorder recognized in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, and that is anorexia nervosa. Anorexia was recognized in the very first edition of the DSM when it came out in 1952, and it's been a continuous inclusion in the DSM since that time. I want to underscore here, in relation to anorexia, though, that we don't jump to conclusions about people who are very thin, and we don't automatically assume that because somebody is extremely thin, they're rail thin, they're waif-like, that they're necessarily anorectic, because the truth of the matter is that's not the case. For one thing, weight and body size are normally, or more or less normally, distributed. So whereas some people simply are born relatively large with a genetic loading or predisposition to be heavy, to be fat, other people on the other end are born with and have a genetic loading or predisposition toward being very, very thin. On the heavy side, some people will remain large and relatively heavy almost regardless of what they do or don't eat, and on the thin side, the same thing is true. That is, no matter how much they eat, it's just very difficult to gain weight. So all I'm saying is that genetics has a major loading in relation to body size, and you can't assume that because someone is thin, even extraordinarily thin, they're necessarily anorectic. In addition, there are a wide number of different medical conditions that can cause thinness and emaciation, and they have nothing at all to do with anorexia. For example, somebody might have experienced cancer or chemotherapy for that matter. They might have thyroid disorders, they might have multiple substance abuse problems, and all of these can be linked to being profoundly thin without in any way, shape, or form implicating an eating disorder per se. Anorexia, the term anorexia and anorexia nervosa, refers to the loss of appetite. Anorexia means loss of appetite, and nervosa suggests that the loss of appetite is due to nervous conditions. Really, the term anorexia nervosa is a misnomer on both counts. First of all, anorectics don't actually lose their appetite. To the contrast or contrary, they oftentimes are famished. They are hungry continuously. In fact, many times they will use those feelings of hunger as a kind of red badge of courage. They use it as an indication that they are still doing well. When they're not hungry, they become concerned that they are eating too much. And so hunger becomes a kind of cue, a kind of feature that signals their relative success. But they don't lose their appetite, they actually retain it, and they are chronically hungry, starved, and famished. Secondly, the term anorexia nervosa is a misnomer because it really isn't a nervous condition. When we think of a nervous condition, we tend to think of anxiety, like an anxiety disorder. Anorexia nervosa is not an anxiety disorder. It's not included in the anxiety disorder section in the DSM. It really has nothing to do with anxiety or nerves per se. It has to do with the way that the concept of nerves were understood back when DSM first introduced the concept into the manual. And there, the concept of a nervous breakdown had to do with a kind of psychological, emotional, or sort of metaphysical, heuristically similar concept to a neural breakdown, that is, a breakdown in the nervous system, the structure and organization of the nerves, about which we knew virtually nothing at that time. So it's really, the term anorexia nervosa is an accident in some ways of the time in which it was discovered and labeled, and it is on most counts a misnomer. The person neither loses their appetite nor is it due to anxiety. Let's talk then about the particular kinds of criteria that define anorexia. Think for a moment about what you think of when you think of an individual who's anorectic. Chances are you think about one of the criteria that define the disorder. Of course, the first, the primary, the most conspicuous, the most visible, is the refusal to maintain a normal body weight. This is defined as weight or weight loss that leads to weighing 15% or more below the expected norm for a person's age and height. Or if they're prepubescent, they just fail to reach the expected weight. As an example, this could be an individual, a young woman who is, say, 5'4", and she would be expected to weigh about 120 pounds, but instead weighs only 102 pounds or less. This would be an example of somebody who meets the criteria for anorexia according to the weight criteria. But of course there are other criteria as well. The second one has to do with an intense fear of gaining weight. Now, when I say an intense fear of gaining weight, the person actually is terrified of gaining not 5 pounds or 10 pounds, but of half a pound or even ounces. That is, fat weight is regarded almost in phobic proportions as a terrifying thing. For this reason, they oftentimes will avoid eating foods that are highly caloric or that have fat. For example, they may subsist or eat primarily things that are vegetables or fruits, perhaps concentrating on, maybe even limiting themselves primarily or exclusively to things like carrots or celery sticks and water. All of this is designed to prevent the possibility of gaining weight. Of course, they also relatedly very much fear intervention that's designed at making them gain weight. So they avoid treatment at all costs. Oftentimes, anorectics, for example, will be extremely thin, and they will recognize that because they're so thin, people will call attention to it and try to intervene and fatten them up. So they actually fear being fat so much that they will wear bulky clothing and they'll try to disguise how thin they are for fear of attracting attention. So on the one hand, I dread being fat, and I think looking thin is good, and so I get very, very, very thin. On the other hand, I don't want people to see how thin I am because I know they will try to come and fatten me up. This is related to the third criteria, which is a distorted perception of body size or shape. For example, thinking that you're overweight even when you are extremely thin. And of course, the person's self-esteem or self-worth, self-confidence is then also greatly influenced by their body weight. Sometimes, for example, an anorectic woman who is substantially thin, you or I would look at her and see her as absolutely emaciated, and to the level that we would actually be alarmed or concerned, she would actually think that she was still fat and be able to identify areas of her body that seemed to her to be podgy, to be pudgy, to be bulky, to be overly fat, that she was still working to reduce. In other words, this represents a substantial distortion of perception. It's not a realistic appraisal of body size, shape, or weight, but rather a profoundly distorted perception. When I say that self-esteem is related to eating and size, I really mean that everything then in the anorectic's world is about losing weight in order to feel good about themselves, controlling what they eat, controlling how much they eat, controlling their weight, controlling their body size in an effort to retain or control a sense of discipline, a sense of well-being, a sense of confidence, a sense of esteem. So self-worth is tied to weight loss. The difficulty is that enough is never enough. That is, there is satisfaction about retaining your weight or reducing your weight, but whereas for you or for me, if we felt heavy, we might say, gee, I need to lose 5 pounds, I need to lose 10 pounds. And as we move toward losing that 5 or 10 pounds, we would feel better about ourselves until we got to a point that we were comfortable. In anorexia, enough is never enough. That is, the more you lose, the more you want to lose. You never feel satisfied with however much it is you lose, and there is always a continuous feeling of being haunted or tormented by potential gains. I may feel good about losing 5 pounds, but then I become terrified about regaining a half a pound. In other words, they put themselves in a position where they quite literally can't win for losing. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is that for women who are post-puberty, the absence or cessation of a regular period of menses, 3 consecutive periods, is also the fourth defining feature. Of course, if you're prepubescent, it would be never having had a menstrual cycle. This is an interesting criteria because it's contentious on the one hand. It seems fairly arbitrary that a woman would have to miss 3 consecutive menstrual cycles rather than 2 or 4 or 5. But the other thing is that oftentimes the presence of the period gets used as a marker for the anorectic of her success in relation to retaining a body weight. In other words, when they have a period, they become extremely guilty, extremely self-angry, loathing, because it's clear evidence to them that because they're having their period, they're not starving themselves enough. It's clear evidence that they are so fat that they're now having their periods. If only they could starve themselves enough, if only they could reduce their body weight enough, and if only they could get rid of enough fat and become so lean that they lost their period, only then would they have a sense that they were just beginning, not succeeding, but beginning to accomplish their weight goals. So the presence of a period actually is a dreaded and feared thing. The elimination of it is actually a marker of some measure of success. Now, the DSM recognizes a couple of different types of anorexia, the restricting type and the binge eating or purging type. The restricting type, in the restricting type, it's during the episode of anorexia, the person doesn't engage in binge eating or purging behaviors, but instead they rely on simple fasting. They consume very little food, and they engage in things like excessive exercise to burn off whatever caloric intake they do have. This is by far the more common, it's the most typical, it's the prototypical form of anorexia, and it probably is the kind of anorexia that you think about when you think about anorexia. On the other hand, there is a second type. The second type is the binge eating purging type of anorectic. It's much less common, but it does occur. And here the person is anorectic and meets all the criteria for anorexia, in addition to which they regularly engage in binge eating or purging behaviors. Well, if they engage in binge eating or purging behaviors, how does this then make them any different from a bulimic? Now, there are two ways in which they differ. First of all, don't forget that because they're anorectic, they still have to meet the weight criteria. That is, they have to be at least 15% below their expected body weight, so that by definition makes them different from bulimics. But secondly, the binge itself is often quite different, both in terms of quantity and in terms of quality. The binge in a anorectic is usually a much smaller binge than it is in bulimic. And secondly, it tends to be a more kind of controlled binge. By that I mean somebody who's anorectic may binge by sitting down and instead of eating 4 carrots and 2 crackers, may eat the whole package of carrots and may eat maybe 4 or 5 crackers. Well, this would be an act of sort of eating discontrol from an anorexic's perspective, but it wouldn't even come close to what a bulimic might do. Instead of a pack of crackers or a pack of carrots, a bulimic might eat a box or 2 of Twinkies and chase that down with a gallon or 2 of ice cream. So both the quality and the quantity of the binge is very different in most instances of bulimia than it is in anorexia. Let's talk some then about the particular definitions of what we mean when we talk about a binge and when we talk about a purge. This is helpful to understanding both the anorectic and the bulimic disorders. When we talk about binge eating, we're talking about eating more than a normal person would eat within a discrete period of time, for example, within a 2-hour period of time. If you and I were to sit down for a couple of hours, say with friends, we might nibble on an appetizer that was shared among people. We might have a salad. We might have an entree that we would eat across a 15, 20, 30-minute period of time, and perhaps we would even indulge ourselves with a dessert, like a piece of cake. But we'd be doing all of this basically in a context of enjoying the food, tasting the food, savoring the food. How's your meal? Oh, mine's excellent. How's your chicken? Oh, it's really good. It's very tasty. So we would be having a positive experience, maybe even a social experience, and we definitely would be taking stock of the flavors and textures of the food. Maybe we would imbibe 1,000 or 1,500 calories, and we would leave the table feeling quite full, quite stuffed, quite satisfied, and that would be a reasonable kind of eating experience across a 2-hour period of time. A binge, by comparison, is a qualitatively and quantitatively different thing. First of all, it's much more likely to be done alone. That is, the fear of eating or appear like you're binging in public. The person becomes seclusive. They eat secretly. They go into their own room. They go into a closet. They go into their bedroom, and they eat vast quantities. We're not talking about a nibbling at an appetizer. We're talking about just stuffing their mouths with a huge quantity of food, starting with a Twinkie and then just eating through the entire box of Twinkies, starting with a scoop of ice cream, going to a bowl, then to the whole carton. Perhaps I would just pull out the carton and get a tablespoon and just start cramming that ice cream into my mouth. Now, importantly, rather than the 1,000 or 1,500 calories that you or I might have across a 2-hour period of time, they may have 10 or 20,000 calories. In addition, they're not enjoying or savoring the food. In fact, they most often either don't taste it or they just eat it robotically, mechanically, and automatically. It's not designed to be a positive experience. It quite commonly is either a deeply ambivalent or even a negative experience. It's an act of impulsive binging. A person cannot control the amount of food that they are sort of stuffing into their face. A purging behavior, by contrast, is the compensatory thing. That is, the person engages in vomiting, for example, self-induced by sticking their fingers down their throat, or by drinking a toxic substance, an emetic, such as Ipecac, to induce vomiting. Ipecac is a vomit-inducing substance. You can buy it over the counter. Many young parents carry Ipecac with them in order to induce vomiting in case their kids tie into some kind of toxic substance. They eat furniture polish or some non-nutritive and potentially dangerous form of food, of non-food, and then they literally give them a tablespoon of Ipecac to make them throw that up. So Ipecac is a form of an emetic. They may also, that is, bulimic individuals purging, may use laxatives as a way to compensate for caloric intake, or they may take water pills to sort of fill themselves up, or they may use other forms of compensation, like excessive exercise, for example, to, again, compensate for the caloric intake that they've just taken part of. Importantly, these binges that then lead to the purges are often the purging is oftentimes triggered by a profound sense of sort of guilt. So the person binges, then they feel absolutely horrible after a 20-minute binge, after an hour binge, after a 2-hour binge. They're absolutely stuffed, they're uncomfortable, and they feel very, very guilty and ashamed, and so then they go and trigger a binge, they trigger a purge in order to undo all the damage they've done to themselves. Well, this sets us up to understand then in more detail the criteria for bulimia, which include the following. First of all, they have to have recurrent episodes of binging and eating. It can't be a single episode. It has to be recurrent episodes. What do we mean by recurrent? Well, we mean that the person has to experience minimally a binge purge cycle at least twice a week for at least a 3-month period of time. In other words, this is not a single event. It's not a matter of going and overeating, feeling uncomfortable, having a distended belly, feeling like you're going to throw up, and so you do simply because you feel so incredibly uncomfortable, you've eaten too much at the smorgasbord or whatever. That would be a single episode. That would not qualify you for a binge purge cycle or for bulimia. Secondly, the individual has to feel a lack of control over eating during the binge cycle. We talked about this. It's a behavioral impulsive control disorder. It represents discontrol. That is, the person cannot control that eating. Sometimes we eat more than we are comfortable with, but we don't eat more than we're comfortable with because of discontrol. We eat it because we really like the food. Years ago, there was a potato chip company, there still is, called Lay's Potato Chips, and their ads used to say that basically Lay's potato chips are so delicious, I bet you can't eat just one. And the whole concept was that once you ate one, you'd have to keep eating more. And of course, you recognize, whether it's with potato chips or Doritos or some other tasty food, that sometimes you will wind up maybe starting to eat one or two, and before you know it, you finished off half the bag, more than you would have wanted, but you're eating it because you enjoy it, because it tastes good. That's not the same as a binge, where the person oftentimes, again, either doesn't taste the food or it's aversive, but they just keep sort of stuffing themselves. It's got to be a lack of control over the eating experience. Third, there has to be a regular use of purging behaviors to prevent weight gain. Now, this has to occur, again, at least twice a week for a period of 3 months or longer. So it's not a single episode of purging. It occurs regularly. It becomes a mechanism for routinely dealing with the ingestion of calories. So at least twice a week for 3 months or longer, the individual engages in these sort of purging behaviors to prevent weight gain. Fourthly, the individual has to have a self-evaluation that is unduly influenced by body shape and weight. I feel good only to the extent that I look good. That if I eat too much, if I become fat, then I am worthless. I am self-loathing and hating. I feel anxious. I feel depressed. So their sense of their self-worth has to be unduly influenced by their body shape and by their weight. And then fifthly, the binge eating and purging cannot and does not occur exclusively during episodes of anorexia nervosa. Obviously, in this case, binge purge type. This is important because this fifth criteria speaks to a common thing that occurs in all the criteria sets throughout the DSM, and that's what's called the rule-out criteria. In this case, you cannot diagnose a person as bulimic if they meet the criteria for anorexia. Think about it this way. Anorexia trumps bulimia. If you had an individual who was an underweight bulimic, that is, they were binging and purging, but they were 15% or more below their expected body weight, they would not get diagnosed in the DSM now as bulimic. They would get diagnosed as anorectic. You can only be diagnosed as one and only one of these disorders, and that's anorexia, not anorexia and bulimia. Let's talk for just a second about the kinds of purging behaviors or compensatory behaviors that individuals with bulimia utilize. This figure depicts a range of different mechanisms that bulimic women utilize. In this case, it's a study of 50 women who are diagnosed with bulimia, and we're looking at the percentage of them that use various and sundry forms of compensatory behavior or purging. All of the women in this sample used self-induced vomiting as a mechanism to compensate for their binges. Virtually all of them used fasting, chronic dietary constraint or restraint, dieting as mechanisms for compensating for them. A very high percentage used excessive exercise, and here let me pause to say that exercise in this instance is not the kind of thing that you do when you go to the gym to keep your shape or to stay healthy. It's not what you do that's designed to promote health. It's what you do pretty much primarily or exclusively to undo caloric intake. I've binged, and so I must go to the gym, and I will stay there until the Stairmaster indicates that I have dispensed with 1,000 calories. So this is not about going to jazzercise to feel good, to connect with people, to enjoy myself, to enjoy my body, to get healthy. This is much more narrowly about undoing damage that I've done to myself. You can see that well over half, nearly 60% of these women used laxatives as a way of undoing their binge behaviors. A substantial percentage, about 40%, used diet pills, and then it drops down in terms of the percentage of these women who are using diuretics and emetics as ways of compensating for the caloric intake associated with their binges. Again, let me just mention in relation to the binge that we are talking about substantial food intake under pretty restricted contexts. So these are not people who are simply grazing all day long, but rather they are engaging in a very acute episode of substantial caloric intake. They're doing it at least twice a week for at least 3 months, but that's the minimum criteria to qualify for a binge. The average bulimic actually binges about 14 times a week, which translates into twice a day, and that doesn't even come close to the highest levels of binging or purging recorded. The highest number of recorded binges in a day is 40. If you're engaging in that magnitude of binging, several times a day, that is going to be a very significant disorder with a number of medical complications that we'll talk about in a later presentation. Again, during a binge, a bulimic person can consume 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, up to 20,000 calories in a single sitting. Again, they're not eating an ice cream cone. They're not binging by eating a double scoop of ice cream. They're not binging by eating a triple or quadruple scoop of ice cream. They're binging by eating the gallon of ice cream or 2 gallons of ice cream. Importantly, the binges are most commonly triggered not by hunger cues, but by emotional issues. And this is important because what happens here is that the individual experiences some kind of a negative event, or they simply starve themselves to the point that they're just absolutely ravenous, and then they get really anxious and upset. And then basically it triggers a kind of moving into this kind of binge to compensate for this bad negative feeling, and they go about the business then of just ingesting a huge quantity of food in a very short period of time. So the way the cycle works is this: many bulimics can no longer, after a period of time, come to distinguish their feelings of hunger, that is, feeling full or satisfied, from powerful, particularly negative emotions, such as anger, fear, loneliness, sadness, and so forth. It's almost as if those powerful feelings begin to substitute for, become confused with hunger cues, and it propels or impels this kind of binge to satisfy or take care of those powerful feelings. So, for example, a bulimic individual may experience a negative event. Maybe they get a bad grade. This leads to kind of an emotional upset. They're all, distraught, and then they go binge. After the binge, they feel ashamed, they feel guilty, they feel bad, they feel self-loathing, which then they go try to compensate for. Let me go undo this by purging. The purging then may temporarily relieve that kind of anxiety or the kind of shame or guilt, but then, of course, it leads to ongoing feelings in its own right. What's the matter with me? Why can't I control things? Am I crazy? What is my problem? And that can also then, of course, lead to another binge, or simply another emotional event comes along that then triggers the cycle all over again. The binge purge cycle looks like this. We might have an emotional event, for example, the bad grade. Or maybe you talk to your parents on the phone and they yell at you for something that you did or didn't do. You got a bad grade, you disappointed them, you spent too much money, or whatever. That emotional event then triggers negative feelings. You feel badly, you feel guilty, you feel anxious, you feel upset, you feel distraught. These then get misrepresented as hunger, or they simply create this kind of negative ball of emotions. You're just sort of overwrought, you're distraught with this sort of negative ball of emotions. And it triggers kind of feeling impelled to go eat, to go pig out. And that's exactly what happens with bulimic individuals. They then satisfy or address these negative feelings by going and just gorging. Of course, as soon as they gorge, they immediately feel a kind of shame, guilt, self-loathing. They hate themselves. They wonder and worry, what's wrong with me? I'm going crazy. And so they try to regain control and to compensate for this binge by engaging in some kind of purging behavior or compensatory behavior. That is, they go induce vomiting, they take a laxative, they engage in fasting, they promise they'll never eat again, or they engage in excessive exercise. This is the binge purge cycle. Now, what's important to keep in mind in this regard is that there's a kind of irony that occurs here. No matter what the bulimic does to try to quote-unquote get rid of these calories, the calories, some of them at least, are still going to stick. They're still going to be digested. They're still going to be assimilated into the body. If you think about it for a second, the person may binge for 30 minutes, may binge for an hour, may binge for 2 hours. Well, the caloric absorption begins when they first start eating, not when the binge is done. So this means that people who rush off, say they feel shameful, they feel horrible, they feel guilty after a 2-hour binge is done, and they rush off then to induce vomiting. Well, their body has still been ingesting those calories and digesting those calories for that period of time, so at least 1,000 or or so calories are likely to be retained even if vomiting occurs pretty quickly after the binge. For individuals who use laxatives, of course, those work much less effectively, much more slowly, and much more gradually. So laxative use may decrease caloric intake only by 10 to 15%, say 12% overall. So yes, you've engaged in a compensatory behavior, but you've consumed 20,000 calories and you've gotten rid of 2 of those, leaving 18,000 calories behind. So it's a compensatory behavior, but it doesn't mean that it's actually a particularly effective compensatory behavior. At the same time, while it's not particularly effective, it is inviting significant and dangerous medical complications. Those could include cardiac malfunctions. They can include kind of liver implications. We'll talk about those when we specifically target the medical complications of eating disorders. But more importantly, they also just sort of tend to reinforce getting trapped in a cycle of disordered eating. In this case, fasting, for example, leads to a profound ravenousness or hunger, which may lead to a binge, which then leads to this feelings of shame and guilt and a purge, which then renews a commitment to fasting, which then results in a subsequent binge, and so forth. The cycle goes on and on and on. Importantly, I want to emphasize that many people with eating disorders do not understand the medical features, and they certainly don't understand the nutritional needs of the body. For this reason, it can be very helpful to include dietary consultation with a nutritionist over the course of treatment so people understand what their bodies do need to be able to function effectively and healthily. Nutritional consultation and the use of a dietitian or a nutritionist is oftentimes extremely helpful, but rarely is it sufficient for dealing with the emotional issues associated with bulimia. In bulimia, as with anorexia, there are actually 2 types, and let me mention the subtypes that include purging and non-purging types. Because we've talked about these, you'll understand them already pretty clearly. The purging type is just that, an individual who uses active forms of vomiting, laxatives, diuretics, diet pill use in order to compensate for the calories associated with a binge. The non-purging type, by comparison, uses more passive forms of compensatory behavior. They're not inducing vomiting, but what they do is they go use excessive exercise, or they engage in prolonged fasting as a way to compensate for the calories associated with a binge. So one way to think of it is kind of an active versus passive, or maybe an immediate versus a more delayed form of compensation for binging behavior. Well, let me conclude the discussion of bulimia by saying just a couple of things that distinguish it from anorexia, in addition to the criteria and features we've talked about. One, bulimia is much more common than anorexia. Anorexia may represent only about 1% or so of the overall population, and bulimia, of course, is substantially, maybe 10 times that much more common. So it's much more common of the 2 different disorders. And secondly, the age of onset for bulimia tends to be later than anorexia. With bulimia, it's not uncommon for somebody to start to become bulimic around age 20 or their early 20s. In contrast, individuals with anorexia very commonly start earlier, even in pre-adolescence or early adolescence. It's also the case that unlike anorexia, bulimia is not visible. It's not visible in the sense that most people who are bulimic are either normal weight or slightly overweight, whereas individuals who are anorectic are conspicuously and clearly underweight. There is a third category in addition to anorexia and bulimia that's recognized within the DSM-4 TR, Diagnostics and Statistics Manual text revision, and that is the eating disorder not otherwise specified, or EDNOS. Now, in the DSM, every single category has a not otherwise specified designation. The not otherwise specified designation is designed as sort of the catch-all category, the category of individuals who have a particular disorder, but they don't fit any of the specific ones that are identified in the DSM. In other words, it's the catch-all or leftover category. People are clearly disturbed, but they don't meet the criteria for those disorders that are described and identified in the manual. So there's an eating disorder, or there's a not otherwise specified for every single category of disorders. There are anxiety disorders not otherwise specified, mood disorders not otherwise specified, psychotic disorders not otherwise specified, and so forth. Similarly, there's an eating disorder not otherwise specified. But the difference is, and this is a very substantial difference and a very contentious one, is that the eating disorder not otherwise specified category is actually larger and more frequently utilized than the other particular categories put together. In other words, more people are diagnosed with eating disorder not otherwise specified than with either anorexia or bulimia or both of those put together. In fact, 2/3 to 3/4 of all diagnosed eating disorders are eating disorders not otherwise specified. Another way to put that is that more people fall in between the cracks than actually meet the specific criteria for eating disorders. Eating disorders not otherwise specified is by far and away the most commonly used diagnosis within the DSM for the eating disorder category. Well, what would some examples of eating disorder not otherwise specified be? Well, there would be a ton of them. For example, you might have a woman who meets all the criteria for anorexia, but she hasn't yet missed 3 consecutive periods. Maybe she's missed one, maybe she missed one this month, one 3 months ago, but she hasn't yet met the criteria of 3 consecutive missed periods. So she would be diagnosed as eating disorder not otherwise specified and would not yet meet the criteria for anorexia. Similarly, you could have somebody who had met the criteria for anorexia, but they had their weight restored to 15% or better than 15% of the normal expected body weight. And as they gain weight, as they fell only 10% or 5% or even below their weight expectation for their normal group or normal weight altogether, they would lose the diagnosis of anorexia even though they may still have all the other features, that is chronic dietary consciousness and fear of becoming fat and so forth. So this would be another example. You could also have somebody who engaged in binge eating without the accompanying purging or compensatory things. There actually is the consideration for the upcoming DSM-5 of including a category of disorders called binge eating disorder, BED, but that's not a current disorder in the DSM. So if somebody engages in binging, but they don't engage in any kind of purging or compensatory behavior, they really don't meet the criteria for bulimia, so they would be diagnosed as eating disorder not otherwise specified. Of course, there are lots of other ones, potentially forms of compulsive eating, where people just eat compulsively, or where you have a chronic overeating disorder, people grazing all the time, always thinking about and wondering and obsessing about their next possible meal. Those would be individuals who wouldn't meet the criteria for anorexia, wouldn't meet the criteria for bulimia, and would instead be a not otherwise specified. This invites the consideration of a major concern that's levied at the whole category of eating disorders in the DSM, and that is, if more people don't meet the criteria for specific disorders than do, maybe we should change the way in which everything is looked at altogether. So this introduces the concept of considering trans-diagnostic considerations or a dimensional view of eating disorders. What this means, what these refer to, is to recognize that disordered eating is a kind of moving target, that people come into and out of particular features, factors, or criteria, but that the underlying dimensions are still present. So an anorectic who gains 5 pounds and is no longer 5%, 15% below, say, her body weight, still could be anorectic. That is, the issues of control, the issues of an undue sense of self-worth being tied to weight and so forth persist, even though the person may be having her period or may have gained enough weight to be normal weight. So the notion is maybe we should reconfigure the entire system so that it acknowledges that these dimensions of disorder may persist even when specific criteria aren't met. Maybe somebody doesn't need to binge or purge twice a week in order to still have an underlying disorder that warrants or merits attention. So these are considerations that unquestionably will be addressed as we move forward in the revision of the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. But for now, the discussion of these issues, I think, helps set the stage for the overall discussion of eating disorder, recognizing here in this presentation that we've talked about the 3 primary classifications of clinical disorders, that is anorexia, bulimia, and eating disorders not otherwise specified, but that many of the issues that surround these disorders, around body satisfaction and self-worth, around control, around discipline, around self-starvation, about the connection of appearance with self-image, are things that also will obtain when we talk about some of the other manifestations and forms of eating struggles that occur across the whole range or spectrum of disordered eating.